Welcome everyone this evening. I really appreciate everybody being here. I'm Emily Chadwick. I'm the chair of Portsmouth Smart Growth. Portsmouth Smart Growth is an all-volunteer-led nonprofit that presents ideas and encourages discussion around planning issues in Portsmouth and the Seacoast. Our goal is to support a vibrant, sustainable, livable, and walkable community. All of our events are free and open to the public. We are especially excited tonight to bring Simon O'Byrne to speak. He's an award-winning designer and planner. He's the Senior Vice President of Community Development at Stantec, which is a global design firm, and chair of Edmonton's Winter City Initiative in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Simon has led multidisciplinary design teams and planning and successful delivery of large, complex, and politically charged projects throughout Canada, the US, and the UK. And for the past 8 years, he has chaired the Edmonton Winter City Initiative to bring a city that's vibrant for residents and tourists throughout the winter months. We are also welcoming tonight our moderator, who's going to be Valerie Rochant. She is the president of the Chamber Collaborative of Greater Portsmouth. Valerie will be providing some insights into what's currently happening here in Portsmouth, as well as voicing some of the questions that you guys provide in the chat. She will sort of be interacting with Simon to present some of those questions. So again, we highly encourage everyone, any questions you have, to use the chat feature of Zoom to interact. And when we have those moments for questions, to use the chat feature to ask your questions. You can find out more information about us, Portsmouth Smart Growth. You can also watch videos of any of our past events, and also, of course, make donations at portsmouthsmartgrowth.org. You can also follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. We rely on the generosity of our sponsors and your donations to host national thought leaders like Simon O'Byrne. So we are really grateful to everyone who has contributed, and we are so thankful for everybody that has helped make this evening possible. We would especially like to thank our supporters. A big thanks to our season sponsors, the Piscataqua Savings Bank and the Jeffrey E. Clark and Martha Fuller Clark Fund of the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. And also a really big thank you to our event partners for this evening, 3S Art Space, who's helping us with the run the Zoom aspect of the presentation tonight, Seacoast Media Group, and the Chamber Collaborative of Greater Portsmouth. So on this snowy, particularly winter feeling evening, we're really looking forward to this conversation and looking at the benefits of activating our public spaces throughout the winter season and thinking about specific strategies that cities like Portsmouth can employ to promote social interaction and vitality in the cold and quiet months. So please help me to welcome Simon O'Byrne.
Hello, everyone. How are you doing? Really excited to be talking tonight and sharing some thoughts about winter. I can share my screen here. And can I get maybe Emily, a thumbs up if you can see it well? Perfect. Thank you very much. So really delighted to be talking to you tonight. I wish it was in person. I'm sure all of you feel the exact same. I was in Portsmouth before, had a wonderful meal on the coast, and was fortunate enough to stay in a 17th century house, which was just remarkable. One of the more charming of cities I've ever been to. So I really do wish it was in person, but because it's this medium, I think it's really important that we try to engage as much as possible. And as Emily mentioned, I really encourage you to be prolific on the chat box. So while I'm doing this presentation, post comments, questions, and then what we're going to do is try to break it into different chapters. And so the different chapters are going to focus on winter life. And then we'll have a 5-minute break where we talk about, or where I answer or respond to a couple of comments. And then we'll go to the next chapter. Because this is a medium where it's tough from an energy perspective because it's two-dimensional to get the same exchange of energy that we would in person. I really want people to use the chat box. Tell me what you like, don't like, comments, questions. engage with each other while it's going on. I encourage you to do that. And then we'll break it into segments. That way it's not a too long presentation in one go. And then at the end of the fourth chapter, then we'll have a more kind of open dialogue and so forth as well, when we take our little breaks after each chapter, and we talk for a couple minutes. I encourage you to turn your cameras back on so we can see each other, exchange, go to the large gallery format so you can see other folks that are on the call. So with that as a bit of context and preface, I'm looking forward to sharing some of my experiences having been thinking and worrying about Winter City for the past 8 years. So one of the things that really kind of struck me as we started getting into it was that when Edmonton, for those that don't know, it takes me, if I were to hop in a car right now and drive due south, it would take me about 6 hours to reach the Montana border. So Edmonton's a city that's a little bit east of the Canadian Rockies, about a 6-hour drive north of Montana. And it's a city that is about 1 million people in the city, another 500,000 people in the region. So roughly about 1.5 people in the region. This is a picture of what Edmonton looks like. It's a city at 53 degrees latitude. And as noted in the chat box earlier, it's really cold right now. We had about 4 weeks that was unseasonably warm for this time of year, but that came to an abrupt end about a week ago. But unseasonably warm for us was in the 30s, and the odd day that was 40, 45. That was considered unseasonably warm for us for the last half of December and early part of January. So it kind of gives you a little context. And now we're into the real deal. So Edmonton's really tried to get Winter City going several times. And at the end of this, I'll tell you why it's really succeeded this time. When we started before, there wasn't enough thought put into implementation, enough thought put into who's going to own it. And I'll get to some of that at the end, why it's really important as we think about Portsmouth and Portsmouth's potential to become truly a 4-season place for both people to live in, work in, play in, study in, and for tourists and other people as well. But one of the things that I really encourage you to do is a lot of the work we did, we've posted on the City of Edmonton website. So if you were to Google Winter City Edmonton, you'd find all kinds of resources on Winter City design, life, how do you encourage business in winter, what are some of the ideas on it? And we really canvass the world to kind of look at the best ideas. We engage with Mongolia, with Sapporo, Japan, with all kinds of Northern European cities. Different places all over North America. And we looked at best practices and we kind of took them and then we adopted them to and put them into the context of Edmonton and what works in Edmonton for our unique environment as well. But I really encourage you to go to these websites, look at some of the videos, download the documents. We really would love you to crib from them. Good ideas don't belong to just one community. We want everyone to adopt good ideas and try to borrow them, and maybe 3 of them, maybe 300 of the ideas apply to Portsmouth. But I'd like you to kind of have a look at that and think about how Portsmouth could be better today and tomorrow. Winter is such a critical time of the year. And I think it's even more important in the context that we now, all the time now, we think, as I'm an urban planner and urban designer, and we're always thinking about social isolation and depression and even suicide. And how do we improve the urban life so that people can be happier? When you have a darkness that comes with winter, it's important, and the cold that comes with it, and people hibernate, it's really important that we do things that are going to increase and add to people's mental health and make it better and richer. And it's important that we as city builders, and a lot of you on the call either are actively involved in city building or really care about it, and you're involved with your respective community. So I want you to think about how your city can be different. How can it be a better place for all 4 months of the year? One of the things that I often do when I'm consulting with developers is I ask them, have you thought about Winter City design? And they go, no, what's that? And I go, well, how vibrant and successful is your development, whether it's a main street, a standalone business, maybe it's a town center and a master plan community. And I ask, well, how vibrant and successful is it in January? And they go, well, what's January? It's never vibrant or successful. And I go, That's right. And the reason is because you haven't thought about winter city design. So one of the things I often say to whether it's chambers of commerce or it's a downtown association, when I talk about winter city design is if you're not thinking about winter city design, then you should really only be doing a performer for 8 months of the year and not 12 months of the year. If you really want a performer for 12 months of the year, then you have to completely change the narrative. You have to design for how is this project, whether it's a park, whether it's a street, a plaza, whether it's a brand new community, a brand new development, or it's simply just a downtown association, you want to make it more vibrant and successful. If the outcome is we want to make it successful in January, if you achieve that, and you have to be very thoughtful and deliberate to make a place successful in January, if you do that in January and you achieve it, it'll do unbelievably well in July. Because in cities that get a winter, it requires no effort to get people in Boston or Portsmouth or St. Paul, Minnesota to go outside in July. It requires zero effort. But you have to be very deliberate and thoughtful about how you do it in January. So if you design for a place to be successful in January, you'll hit it out of the park in every other season. And that's the type of mindset flip that you have to do, because we've all seen architectural renderings that have been done. And I guarantee you 99 out of 100 architectural renderings you've ever seen depict it as though it is, July 4th, fireworks going off, or kids licking ice cream in shorts walking down the street, and strollers going down the street. And they never ever depict scenarios of what does this place look like in January? What does the light look like in January? What happens to snow and ice and wind in the middle of winter? We don't think adequately about that. So it's so important as city builders to think about winter city. And part of that means creating places that people would want to be, and thinking about maintenance. One of the biggest problems with design of parks and downtowns and public spaces is that we don't often put enough resources aside for winter and how it interacts. One of the things that we were shocked to do is that the 90% of our city budget was basically for parks was to be spent between the months of call it April 1st to Halloween. And then we just presumed that almost nobody was using our parks in the middle of wintertime. Well, one of the things when we started doing the Winter City strategy was start to say, well, let's actually go out there and send volunteers out and some paid staff out and actually do head counts and find out how many people are actually using our parks in the dead of winter. We were shocked. Way more people were using parks in the dead of winter than we thought. And we thought, well, what happens if we're getting nobody using parks in the middle of winter? What happens if we were to actually put money into maintenance and programming in the middle of winter? What might happen? Well, one of the things we did was we did do that. And we started to self, well, what would happen if we put money into festivals? What would happen if we put money into, we put so much money, whether it's from the business community, corporate organizations or philanthropy, they put a lot of money into whether it's music or arts or theater festivals and other events that are going on. And the summer festivals are vibrant. But again, in a winter city climate, in a winter city, it requires no effort to get people to go outside in summer. But in winter, you have to be deliberate. We said, well, what would happen if we took the winter festivals that we do have and we gave them more resources and then we encourage others to start brand new festivals? Well, over the span of 8 years, we've now seen a dramatic proliferation in winter festivals. And had it not been for COVID, we are now averaging 3 to 4 winter festivals at some part of the city every single winter weekend. So there's 3 to 4 festivals, whether they're really small community or they're widespread and they get 300,000 people. And one of the things we've now tried to do is sell ourselves as a winter destination. One of the things that shocked us was that the rack rate for hotels in Copenhagen was higher in January than it was in July. Copenhagen gets more tourists in January than they do in July because people were wanting to go there for an authentic winter getaway. So can you imagine Portsmouth being busier for tourists and activity in January than in the middle of summer? Imagine that. Just think about that. And if it's great for tourists, then it's great for people who live there. So that's the kind of shift that we wanted to see. And part of a lot of what we had to do is really challenge convention. So how are we doing things? We have to allow small startup festivals or people that have crazy ideas, as long as they're not going to hurt anybody, we really have to figure out a way to make them happen, to encourage people to do small, fun, whimsical ideas and maybe create something that'll become charming and magical. Maybe even if they're lucky enough with time, it'll become something that's worthy of people's affection. So it really starts with allowing people to bend the rules, to take risks, to really allow failure to happen. Because I think if there's 10 ideas that come forward from city builders, maybe there's only one or two that are really worth implementing, but you have to allow those failures so that that one or two that are unbelievable transformational ideas can really take root and germinate and become something that becomes worthy of people's affection. And we have to iterate, and we have to do it again and again, encourage that. So we're going to get more. And it also means that people that are in local government have to start with saying yes as opposed to no. If there's a good idea that's going to make a city better in the middle of winter, we have to start with saying yes and reverse engineer a way to make that happen. We have to look at pilot projects. The reason I was like pilot projects, whether it's bike lanes or it's a way to improve a city park or downtown, is that people get their back up the second you say it's permanent, and then they think of all the reasons, the 100 reasons why it can't happen. But if you say it's a pilot project, people go, well, I guess if I hate it and it's horrible, hopefully it'll go away in a year or two. So the people that think that, you know, government should be as small as possible and the only thing government should be doing is fixing potholes, that's how you kind of deal with the crowd that thinks that, you know, the only thing we should focus on is potholes, when creating a wonderful city life is obviously more than that. And we need to speed up the permitting for that, whether it's about creating winter patios or doing other things that are going to create charm and delight. So one of the things we do know that does work is seating. And it's really important when you think about it with COVID, so many cities have now allowed parklets, and they've allowed things to go outside and much more outdoor dining. And the thing about seating and going outside is, nobody that's ever gone to a ski resort in Vermont has ever said, well, I didn't know it was going to be cold, so I didn't dress to be outside having a beer or having a hamburger outside, taking a break while skiing. You didn't. You dressed appropriately to be outside. I guarantee if you were to look at historical photos of Portsmouth from the 1950s, people were dressed appropriately to be outside in the core for hours on end. The trouble now is that too many of us dress with the least amount of clothing, to say, okay, well, the closest I can park my car is likely here, and the entrance I'm going to go to is here. So what's the most scantily clad I can be dressed to suffer walking half a block or 2 blocks to get to that entrance? And what we need to do is embrace winter fashion, have some fun with it, and encourage that sort of thing. But we also need to be able to create places that are going to allow more seating outside. We need to be able to do that. And we've seen the success of it with COVID in all kinds of different cities, and places that have used fire as one of the different elements in order to make it more comfortable. And allowing fire doesn't really make a huge difference unless you're immediately adjacent to it. But there's something psychological that when we see fire, we feel warmer, even if we're 5 feet away and we're not immediately close to it. It just psychologically makes us feel warm. But there's so many cities that are doing amazing things with winter patios, experimenting with putting heaters in the actual seats so you feel warmer, and different heat lamps and different ideas and concepts. One of the things that Paris did was they had a competition to say who could come up with the best winter terrace. And they had competitions, whether it was a bubble that was created, you know, decorative different things that were done to make it more comfortable. My wife and I were fortunate enough to be in Paris a few years ago, but unfortunate enough that we were there during an unusual cold spell. We were in Paris when it was 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you've ever been in Paris in 0 degrees Fahrenheit, it's a cold, humid, nasty winter that's not comfortable. So 0 degrees Fahrenheit there was quite something. But what was shocking was that the patios didn't close. Even though it was 0 degrees Fahrenheit, the patios were open. But what did they do? They had faux fur on every single seat, and there was a blanket waiting for you when you sat in the seat. So you put the blanket on your lap and you sit on the faux fur. And then some of them had heated awnings, but what most of them had was almost a plastic sheet curtain that would pull around the edge of the patio to cut the wind. Because the single biggest thing you can do to create comfort in winter is block the wind. It only takes a whisper of wind to make for an absolutely dreadful, horrid environment. If you cut the wind out, it's so much more comfortable to be outside. And so one of the things that they discovered was that as long as you give people a blanket to put on their lap, and in COVID, it's a BYOB, bring your own blanket, But you sit on something like a faux fur, you have a blanket on, you keep your jacket on, you wear a hat, a scarf. You can sit outside for an hour or two and watch Parisian street life. There's no reason you can't do that in Portsmouth either. The other thing that we know that always works that's magical is skating. People love skating. They're drawn to it. Whether they're a former retired NHL pro hockey player or it's their first time putting on skates, everybody loves to skate. There's something charming and magical about it. So, so many places have done it, whether it's Bryant Park in Manhattan or it's here in Detroit. So many cities have embraced it, and it is utterly transformational when you see what it does to a place. One of the things that I've seen a lot more of, like if you go to Maggie Daley Park in downtown Chicago, are ice ribbons. So this ice ribbon image here is the one in Maggie Daley Park. And that one actually has a refrigeration system so that it can go from basically September till May. And it's got slight grades in it. Many cities, like here in Edmonton where I am, have freezeways. And because there's frost in the ground and it gets cold enough, the ground stays cold for enough months that what happens is the same city trucks that wash the streets and keep them clean in the spring, the watering trucks, they send the watering trucks on these paths through the city parks and through the trees, through forests and so forth. They'll spray water down, and when it hits the ground, and because the air temperature is cold too, the water turns to ice. And so there's these freezeways, and some of them are 2 miles long. So imagine going for a 2 mile long skate through the trees with magical, charming lights on the other side. If you Google image Edmonton Freezeway, you'll see some images where there's beautiful lanterns along the side of it, and people go skating. Imagine skating for 2 miles through the forest. It couldn't possibly be more charming and romantic, and it attracts tourists that come here for an authentic experience like that. St. Paul does one where there's a festival of lights that is put on the lake, and it's magical and charming. People love it. The other thing that really works are night markets. People love night markets, whether it's the one in Nuremberg. This is the Christmas market in Nuremberg, which is really popular and does really well. There's a brilliant one in Toronto in the Distillery District. These are really cheap, easy ways to animate a space that is otherwise not that busy. And it provides a little shelter to the vendor who's selling, whether they're selling honey or hot chocolate, or they're selling local tchotchkes and knickknacks that they've made, whatever that might be, or maybe it's a baker that's selling something. Having those stalls that encourage local vendors to sell stuff. We know that farmers markets are successful. We need to encourage these markets to happen year round. One of the things we were shocked to find was that the farmers markets in Russia go year round. They don't stop the farmers markets when it gets cold. So you can go to Moscow and it can be minus 17 Fahrenheit, and there'll be people out at the farmers market. There'll be just as many stalls at the farmers market in Moscow in the dead of winter as there is in the middle of summer. So we were shocked to find out, because in most cities I know, the farmers markets really kind of stop once it gets too cold, and they start up again in the spring, once asparagus pops up, if you will. And in Moscow, they go year round. So what they do is people just go to the farmers market daily, and it might be fruit or vegetables, and they're basically frozen because it's so bloody cold outside. But they basically bring it home, and it won't last long because it's already been frozen. But they basically use it the second it defrosts, and cook it up or chop it up that night. So it's still really fresh. But it was surprising to find out that no matter how horribly cold it is in the dead of a Moscow winter, it's still very active. It's so important, though, to think about what is the type of infrastructure we need? What are the fireplaces we need? What are the places we're creating for people that's going to think about winter infrastructure? Are we providing warming huts and shelters? A lot of cities, the beaches on the east side of Toronto, on the lake, or in Winnipeg, both cities have architectural competitions every year to say who can design the best warming hut. And so with both cities and their public parks and places that they're skating or people like to go out and hang out, have architectural competitions, and it's a global competition. So a lot of architects from Denmark or from Colorado or all over the place, even as far away as Argentina, will compete to come up with the best design for these kind of warming huts and shelters. And they're really amazing. So some of them have fire, some of them just have really cool architectural lighting, but providing these places can transform a park and make it way more successful. And it's so obvious, but it doesn't happen enough, is that people love sitting around fire. There's something primal about just sitting around a fire and looking at it, and people love it. We need to provide more shelters, whether the ones that have curtains that you can pull around the fire pit, like the one in the top left or top right, or there are other fire pits. One of the cities that's embraced this recently during COVID was we wanted people to have activities outside, but they didn't want to spend a ton of money. So the Forks is kind of like a central park in downtown Winnipeg, Manitoba. And what they did was they put the kind of stringer lights across. So it costs no money, relatively little money, to put stringer lights across. They put Adirondack chairs out, and they put fire pits out, and the city provides some firewood. And you know what? It is packed all the time. And it was kind of a safe way for people during COVID to socially distance, to do this. People would be wearing masks during COVID. People would be you'd also be able to book them and reserve them online, so that you wouldn't have, so that they could be cleaned between different use. And they try to encourage it to be, each household could use it, so that you wouldn't get a lot of cross-pollination across families during COVID. But it was so successful that they're going to just keep this as a permanent installation. So every winter they want to start doing this, putting out a fire pit and putting out stringer lights. And there's no reason that Portsmouth and other cities like Portsmouth couldn't do the same. It's a really quick, cheap intervention to create a charming space in the middle of winter, and people love it. The other thing that's so important here, and this is the end of this first chapter, is to think about something else. So, you know, as a father of a 15-year-old and 10-year-old, and maybe they're a little older in this stage, but I can tell you what, if my kids are whinging and complaining and they're miserable, I'm miserable. So when my kids are happy, I'm happy. If I'm not having to play traffic hop with them. So one of the things you also have to think is, how do we make cities more charming for them in the middle of winter? How can we do fun things with them? One of the things we're shocked to learn from Northern Europe is that many Northern European cities keep the snow in their town square. And then the city workers will go and mash it up every day or two before it hardens. And they encourage kids to make impromptu slides, make little forts out of it, make little walls out of it, paint all the walls, do different things with that, like totally whimsical, fun stuff like that. People love that. And there's no reason that we can't do it there. So I'm going to stop there and stop sharing while we kind of talk for a couple minutes and see what kind of questions maybe came up, Valerie.
Thank you, Simon. There is so much that you just shared with us that is exciting and doable, and that we could bring into Portsmouth and our area along the coast. So I appreciate just the energy behind it. Thank you so much. So I will tell you that I am from ski country, and you said something earlier in your presentation. We had a saying that there's no such thing as bad weather. There are poor clothing choices. 100%. And so one of my questions for you is, when you live in ski country and you live in Edmonton, you live in the really cold areas, you have no choice really but to make a decision that you're going to not hibernate for 6 months of the year. You're going to go out and about. But that's something that you learn when you live in that sort of country. So the question for you is, we live on the coast. It is not Edmonton. It's not 20 below. Well, usually, I mean, it can happen, but not usually. So it's a mindset. It's a collective consciousness. It's an agreement that winter is fabulous, and we should not hibernate. We should not stay in. We should get outside. I'm sure you've worked with communities that are dealing with that mindset. And can you share a little bit of how you start to turn that around a little bit?
Well, I think that, Portsmouth does not have the weather of Fargo or Minneapolis, but it also has other challenges. So Fargo and Minneapolis might get colder in terms of the mercury, but they're also a typical winter day in the northern prairies of North America is blue sky and sunny and doesn't have that much wind. When you're on the coast, you get nor'easters. You get a lot more wind. It's gray often. There's a lot of sleet and it can be cloudy. And that's what we kind of found with Copenhagen, is that Copenhagen is north, but it also it wouldn't get to, for example, it would never get to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. But in wintertime, it is, at least 20 days a month in winter would have gray, rain, or sleet, and it would be, high 20s to high 30s, is a typical winter day in Copenhagen, which is probably, somewhat comparable to Portsmouth. But, and when it does get cold and then the rain turns to snow, you can get snow on an epic level that the middle of the continent would never get. Heavy, wet cement snow. So I think it's got different kinds of challenges, but part of it's about the mindset. I think that too often, I've worked with people in Boston on this and other places, and there's this mentality that because there's always some place that's further north, that's further colder, people like to kind of lie to themselves about how much they're not a winter place. But I find that New England's this kind of funny place where it goes, winter's such a really long, nobody in Florida would say that Portsmouth has a great climate, right? But maybe compared to Fargo, you might think you have a nice climate, right? But what happens is, I think for Portsmouth is that because it's not because it's not as severe, people don't have that mentality. But because they don't have that mentality, I don't think sometimes not enough effort is made to think about how we create vibrancy in the middle of winter. How do we make sure that festival parks, Main Street is busy? Like, how do we make sure that it's as busy in January as it is in July? And we're not deliberate about it because sometimes we don't change the mindset. And the big thing we had in Edmonton is really systems thinking. And systems thinking was to say, let's rather than, because 10 years ago, when we thought about Winter City, Edmonton, it was only about snow clearing. Like, as soon as you said something winter, people just immediately thought all you really want to talk about was what was the city's policy and what's the city's budget for snow clearing. And what we wanted to do was adopt a systems thinking and say, well, how do we think about everything through the lens of winter? So park design, tourism, economy, fashion, quality of life, mobility. How do we complete everything through that lens, as opposed to only thinking about it through the lens of snow clearing, which is what so many places that are in the winter belt do and think.
So thank you. We've got some questions coming in, and let me just share some of them with you. Someone would like to know what type of spaces make for easy winter city conversions. So what are your best practices for spaces?
Well, I'm going to be getting to winter city design shortly, but the short version is it's dark for half the year in winter. Obviously, we have shorter days right now in North America. And so what's really important for us is to, if you have to make a trade-off between ideally you want to put people in the sun as much as possible. That's really critical, and to not create shade opportunities, but to where you want vibrancy to be, you want it to be in the sun. But it's also a dark time of the year. So the single biggest thing you can do is interventions and design for people where you can protect them from the wind. And I'm in a few slides from now, I'm going to show you some ideas on how you can block out the wind and do interventions, because the single most important aspect of winter city design is blocking out the wind.
Excellent. So fire pits, you are absolutely correct. We are all drawn to fire, just like we're all drawn to the sea. So in the city of Portsmouth, we've had this conversation, and rightly so. The fire chief gets a little anxious when we start talking about fire pits. We'll give him that. So who takes care of these fire pits in some of these installations? Is it, you have to have somebody, if it's a wooden fire, you have to have somebody caring for it. You have to have somebody responsible for it, who's liable for it. How do you actually make that work?
Well, I think you have to take some risk. You can't let the city solicitor decide. If the city solicitor designs public spaces, then it's going to be probably the most banal, boring public space. So I think it's really important that you listen and consider the fire chief and what the city solicitor is saying, but and take it into an advisement. But I think it depends what outcome is more important. And I think you have to be able to take some risks. If we wanted no risk, then our playgrounds would be horribly boring. If we would design a playground so no kid could ever get a scratch or a bruise. And I think that it's important that we be able to assume that people are, there's going to be the odd yahoo that's going to do something dumb, but that could happen in any event. I think that we have to be able to tolerate some degree of risk and know that most people are going to be smart and do sensible stuff. One of the things that really shocked me was I was speaking at a conference in Switzerland, and I was in Lucerne, and we went to this brand new rec center that had just opened. Maybe it was 2 months old, and it was a beautiful rec center. And I was shocked to find out, as a North American, it was just blew my mind away. They don't have lifeguards in Europe. So you could go to any public pool in Europe and they don't have lifeguards because they assume that people are going to be sensible and somebody's going to be watching out for other people. So imagine going to a swimming pool and they're like a big swimming pool. It was like a big one. It had a diving pool, a 50-meter lane, and a rec one, and a big hot tub, and there was 0 lifeguards. And it was just weird as a North American. It was just, I couldn't even fathom it. And it told me how when you design when you design out risk, you get a certain outcome. But when you assume that people are going to have to take personal responsibility and do this right thing and the smart thing, that people are going to be okay. And the funny thing was, I told this to the city manager here in Edmonton, and they said, the irony is there are more fatalities in North American swimming pools by drowning than there is in Europe, because in North America, people erroneously presume that they're safe because there's a lifeguard, and invariably a lifeguard looks away at the wrong time, shift change at the wrong time, something happens, or people drop off their kid to go swimming before the kid's fully ready to go in the deep lane and something happens. So that was an interesting thing that I learned. So my point is, you don't put them next to where there's dead trees, but you have fire pits where it makes sense.
And have you found that the next door restaurant or the next door shop or a volunteer is taking care of those fire pits, or is it the city's responsibilities?
In some cases, it might be a downtown association. It could be the city, or it could be a neighborhood community association, whether it's a NGO or other group. In that Winnipeg example I provided, it was the city of Winnipeg, or it was the Forks, which is a not-for-profit of which the city contributes and is on their board. But it was, so it's kind of quasi-local government. So having those, and it's, but when you go to a state park or federal, you go to like a national forest, and you have you're camping there. It's not like there's a park ranger always 10 feet away from you when you're sitting around the fire. Life goes on, and the state park doesn't burn down, or the national park. So I think we have to assume for common sense to prevail.
Great. There's a creative question here. Is there anything like a fountain that can be converted to a fire pit and back again? Have you seen anything like that?
There's a fun one in Victoria Square in downtown Montreal, and it actually uses both. So it's kind of fun in that it's kind of near Old Montreal, and it's a fountain, and they've got fire shooting up from the water, and it's really cool. So if you were to Google image Victoria Square Montreal fire, you probably see images of it, and it's really cool.
Awesome. Emily, how much time do we have for more questions?
I was gonna should go back to the mobility part of it, and then we'll break again in a couple minutes.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Perfect. I'll go back share my screen here. So mobility is kind of where I wanted to go next, and that's really kind of critical too. One of the things when I think about mobility is that my dad unfortunately died 4 years ago at 84, but the last couple of years of his life, my dad had a walker. And I can tell you that one of the things that I never really thought about before my dad having the walker was about how he crossed intersections. And too often our civil engineers don't adequately think about drainage in the shoulder seasons, and we get these freeze thaws. And so there are these, horrifically big, ugly ice, snow, and brown water filled puddles around our intersections. And they're absolutely just horrible places for people in wheelchairs and people in walkers. And it's so important that we think about mobility. We think about mobility in all 4 seasons. We can do raised crosswalks so that they drain better. We can have larger catch basins so that they take the water faster away from intersections. We need to think about drainage, and we need to think about catch basins and how they're located. And we also have to think about how do we minimize the crossing distance for people so that there's the least amount of distance to get from A to B. We also, I know Portsmouth only has 1 transit line, but transit shelters are really critical in winter cities. If we really do want to drive transit usage, then you have to provide shelters. You can't provide shelters in places that get winter and ask people to use transit. It's just too uncomfortable to be standing out there waiting for 5, 10, 15 minutes with blowing wind. Even a shelter that stops the wind has a transformational impact on how comfortable it is to wait for the bus. The other thing is wayfinding, because it's dark, earlier and also in the morning on the commute to work. We also have to think about wayfinding. So what is the wayfinding experience in the middle of winter? Are we thinking about that so it's safe and pleasant and comfortable for people to get around? Winter cycling is also really big. And one of the things that was surprising to me was to see how big truly and I'm going to get to this at the end of the presentation, but how big winter cycling is in so many different cities that have winter climates. Minneapolis is probably one of the leading. Minneapolis and Montreal are probably the 2 leading cities in North America for bike infrastructure. Davis, California too, but that's pretty small. But in terms of larger cities, Minneapolis and Montreal probably built the most bike infrastructure, and Montreal and Minneapolis absolutely have, pretty potent winters. And if they can make winter cycling successful, then so can Portsmouth, and so can so many other places. It's really important that we think about that, and we think about the locations and making barriers. And the comment I always make about biking in winter is that if you're not segregating a bike lane with planters or bollards or other things, other interventions you can do that are going to segregate them, then don't even bother. The strip of paint doesn't work, because the strip of paint, when you simply just put down some green, doesn't cut it, because it gets covered in grit and salt and snow, and they're not comfortable in it. The only people that use them are middle-aged people like me in Lycra, who are, and that's the only people you ever see on them. If you really want to follow that 880 principle, and you want to make it safe, whether you're 80 years old or 8 years old, to be cycling winter, you have to segregate the bike lanes. If you're not segregating the bike lanes in places that get winter, just don't even bother. You'll only get usage for at best half the year. The other thing we're starting to see so much more, and it's so important with winter when we think about segregation of bike lanes, is how do we actually create more environments? How do we do more rails to trails and places like that? So that recently I was in Canmore, which is beside Banff National Park and the Canadian Rockies here, and they've converted all these old railroad tracks to trails, and they're some of the most beautiful trails, because some of the rail lines went through some of the most beautiful parts of North America. So thinking about these as locations for bike lanes is really critical. The other things is parklets and outdoor dining. People love them, and we have to allow the permitting of them. And there's some trade-offs that have to go with them in terms of less parking, traffic management's different. But especially we've seen now during COVID, where we had to do these interventions, how successful and how vibrant they were, and how much people love them. We also have to think about mobility and buses, and how do buses move within spaces? If we really want to encourage transit ridership, then we have to make sure that we have dedicated bus lanes, so that especially during winter climates, where there's snow and ice and sleet and other things, that they're not competing getting in and out as well. And the other important thing is, to the point about saying yes, and starting with yes and engineering way to say yes, is these interventions have to happen really quickly. One of the best things that Janet Zetta-Kahn did when she was head of transportation under Bloomberg in New York was that she did this overnight, and she didn't wait to get the social license. She got the social license from the mayor, and she just did it. And she kind of begged forgiveness after the fact. So when she converted Times Square, or she made a park overnight, or she built bike lanes overnight, she was kind of unapologetic about doing it. And because, you know, there's some cities that have not had a strong transportation person, and they're still farting around years later. I have a friend in the Bay Area, and they're building bike lanes in San Francisco. They had a brand new bike plan, but they couldn't implement it because the environmental studies to build bike lanes in San Francisco were taking 4 years. It was 4 years of environmental approvals to get permission to build bike lanes in San Francisco. And you can go like how does that make sense? But that's kind of the challenge. You need to kind of do these kind of interventions and do them quickly, you know, and, you know, because when it gets cold and you kind of get these kind of temperatures, things change really. We can't wait for this kind of stuff. We can't wait for the next winter. We have to kind of act really quickly. One of the things, and this kind of captures, I was hoping this captures some of you, is one of the things that I was looking at and working on with some colleagues was in Boston, and we were looking at, I kind of use this because it's a New England example, but one of the things we've been looking at is how do we drive different modes of use within a New England climate and within Boston? How do we get more people walking and cycling? What are some of the interventions that we can do? How do we kind of build that up in the context of a winter city like Boston? How do we get MBTA kind of ridership to come back, because it's really suffered and it fell 90% when COVID hit? The solutions to these problems can't be 3-year and 4-year studies. They have to be really quick. We have to be able to experiment. We have to, whether it's about getting transit ridership back, we have to make things more comfortable. We have to be quicker about them. And we have to think about the first mile, last mile, and how that works in the context of winter. And we also have to realize that one of the things that's happening around the world is this concept of 15-minute cities that started in Paris. So many cities are now piggybacking on Paris's concept of the 15-minute city. And so much of Portsmouth lends itself to being a 15-minute city. We know when we have a 15-minute city where you can live, work, play, and study within close proximity to one another, that people that are living a 15-minute lifestyle where they can live, work, play, and study in that 15 minutes tend to walk 10 to 15,000 steps a day. If you walk 10 to 15,000 steps a day, your chance of heart and stroke, which is the #1 killer in North America, goes down by 90%. Your chance of getting diabetes goes down by 85%. So the public health outcomes for building these types of cities and doing these interventions are enormous. The other thing we need to, when we think about preparing streets for winter, particularly now I'm thinking about it, is how does it look in the darkness? How does it function in the darkness? Is it safe? Is it comfortable? Where are we going to put the snow? How cold is it, and how do we make it more comfortable for people? How are we going to be managing the snow? You know, Portsmouth to Boston gets nor'easters, and I know that you had the same horrible snowfall that Boston had. Was it 4 years ago, or was it 5 years ago? When like it was just on an epic scale, and the snow there was no place left to put the snow actually. And so when you get snow on a level that is unimaginable to a person like me. So thinking about snow storage and where do we put it and where do we treat it? And I think about my dad and the walker, and how do you make these cities function in the dead of winter? And also, who are we prioritizing? What do the message send? So when the plow trucks come, are the plows thinking about the bus stop? Are we thinking about the bike lanes? Are we thinking about the pedestrians walking the streets? Or are we only thinking about cars? What are our priorities, and what does that say? What are the things that we can do, like these other examples that are from New England as well, in Salem and in Cambridge, in terms of what they've done and where they put their dollars? These things, these investments that are made, say a lot about what are the priorities and who owns that public space and who gets the priority. The other thing we learn is, I'm in the business of as a urban planner, urban designer, and doing a lot of engineering is snow also tells us where people go and where they don't go. And where you can actually rip up pavement and where you don't. And what's interesting is one of the studies we've actually done is we've actually looked at what do city streets look like post snowfall. And we find out there's way more asphalt than there needs to be. So in this example here is we found out that, that the cars actually weren't going on that area to the left. So why do we need all that asphalt? Why can't we change that into an area and make it even easier for pedestrians to cross the street? So let's put a little island there so that when pedestrians have to cross the street, it's the least amount of distance they have to cross the vehicle lanes in order to get to the sidewalk. That's one of the advantages it has. Same thing with if we want to get people using transit and being comfortable outside. Do we want to have cold people or people that are warm when they're queuing up? Do you also want to be thinking as well about distance and comfort and having the transit data that's going to get people to know what's going on? And how are people walking around spaces? I think there's not enough done to think about the aesthetics, the barriers, the other things that are limiting movement of people and how they get around, like this example in Somerville and suburban Boston. And also, how do we add some light and how do we make it more comfortable to be outside in some of these different respective places? Where are we putting pedestrian lighting to make sure that it's safe as well? Shocks me how many cities I've been to, like I've been to so many, but one of the cities I'll kind of pick on right now is Austin. I've been to Austin, at least a dozen times. And one of the things that surprises me is that, 90% of Austin has no streetlights. So when it's dark outside, it's really dark. So it's great from a dark sky perspective. But I think about, I'm a 6 foot tall, 200-pound man. I'm not worried about safety as much, but my wife, who's 5'2", and my 15-year-old daughter, would I feel comfortable about either one of them going down a dark street? So I think about, and when we are putting in streetlights, are the streetlights for the cars or the streetlights for the pedestrians? So one of the things that's important is to light up the pedestrians, because we want to make sure the pedestrians can see each other and that the cars can see the pedestrians. So it's important that the orientation light be weighted much more towards the pedestrian. These things are really critical, as are different linkages. So how do we take the gaps between buildings and make them places that they're easier to get from A to B and a lot more comfortable? How do we also make intersections nicer and more charming? And how can we add traffic islands to some of them to make it more comfortable in the middle of winter? And I'm going to pause there and stop sharing, and then we can talk a little bit maybe about if anyone has questions about mobility.
Thank you. I am seeing none specific to mobility.
Okay.
I know that one of the issues that we've had as we've been converting restaurants and dining out onto the streets over the last year because of COVID, mobility and access has been top of mind every time we wanted to put restaurants out in the streets, tables and chairs out in the streets. If we were taking over an ADA accessible parking spot, where are we going to relocate that? So what are your thoughts about you've been to Portsmouth, you've seen our streets, you've seen our downtown. It's not Edmonton, it's not huge. It's a historic city, as you can see. Do you have any thoughts about how we can what are the best practices for Portsmouth for making sure that we have sufficient ADA accessible access and access as we keep moving people out into the streets?
Well, I think that, there's not enough budget to do an intervention all at once, but I think it's important that, every time the civil, we have to deal with kind of the civil infrastructure. It has to be done to make it as comfortable and as accessible as it possibly can. And there's some cities, like I remember in Vancouver, which has probably a climate that may be even a closer to a Portsmouth than Edmonton is. And because Vancouver and Seattle have pretty much identical weather. And when they had a mayor back in the 70s, and their mayor was totally disabled and was in a wheelchair, electric wheelchair, couldn't even do it on himself, and he used an electric wheelchair to get around. And seeing him get stuck was transformational on that city. And he really could speak to it with great authority. And having a mayor that was in a wheelchair transformed Vancouver, and they changed their standards. It wasn't even these really kind of rinky-dink curb cuts. It was really comfortable curb cuts that would enable people to get up easily over intersections. You know, the trouble is there's not enough money in the world to do everything that people want to do, but it's important that whenever we do replace the infrastructure, that we really be aware of that and conscientious of it, in order to make the city, you know, a city like Portsmouth way more accessible. You know, we know that we have an aging population. In Portsmouth's part of that in terms of the percentage of the population that is north of 65. And as they get older, like my dad was, your mobility changes. And so we have to make sure that as we have a larger percentage of the population that has increasing mobility challenges, that the city is just as much for them as it is for a healthy 25-year-old. But it's not as much for them if we don't design it with things like that in mind. And that's why I gave that example earlier about drainage. And it's pretty mundane things like that, but it might seem like a small little detail, but when you get it wrong, you really close the city towards a lot of people.
Thank you. This year, the city council approved keeping our barriers down and our restaurants on the streets through the end of November. But as of December, they felt that the plowing was going to be too big an issue and too expensive, quite frankly. They're trying to get around the barriers, number one, but number two, having to load out snow that collected behind the other side of the barriers. And how would you advise on that? How would you address that?
About the barriers?
Well, the whole snow plowing issue.
Well, you know, it's one of these things that it's like there's never enough money, and some cities just have the attitude, well, we're just going to plow it and hope for good weather and rain to take care of it, and we'll put it to the side. And then other cities are much more aggressive on it, and they spend the money on it. So I just think it's a matter of priority. So if mobility is important, then you get rid of the snow. And if you really want to have a tourist economy, you know, if you want to have more tourism, and Portsmouth is a city where, you know, a healthy proportion of the local economy comes from tourism. And if you really want to have winter tourists, then you have to get rid of the snow. And one of the things that Montreal, which also is a city that has a lot of tourists, do is Montreal gets rid of all the snow. So they have a mandate that within 24 hours, all the snow has to be taken off all the streets and sidewalks. And they get rid of it. They don't just plow it and move it to the side. They actually physically move it. Whereas so many other cities like Buffalo, they just push it to the side and you know, and pray for warmer weather or something that would deal with it. And so I think it's a bit of a trade-off. But I think in places, especially that aspirationally would like to have more four-season tourism, to support their local businesses and local hoteliers, you really have to put that priority, spend that money and make it happen.
Thank you.
Should we go back to urban design?
I think that's a great idea.
Okay, I'll pick it up on urban design. So urban design really comes down to 5 really key things. So the number one, the most paramount one, is blocking the wind. There's nothing more important than blocking the wind, because as I mentioned earlier, a whisper of wind can be horrible, but a strong blustering wind is a killer in the dead of winter. Capture sunlight, so we need to be putting people in the sun as much as possible. Too often, places that are further north don't embrace color enough, and we have to embrace color more. We have to do fun things with lighting. We have to think about infrastructure more. And I've talked about infrastructure a little bit, but winter design really comes down to those things. One of the big things is how you block wind. So you can shelter people and physically put them away from it and segregate them from wind. You can build up berms and put coniferous trees on top of them so that they block wind, and put the coniferous trees closer together to block the wind. You can do the Aqua building is the tallest building in the world, designed by a female architect. It's 84 stories tall, right on Lake Michigan and just north of Maggie Daley Park in downtown Chicago and in the Loop. and it's 84 stories tall and doesn't have wind at the bottom, because it was I forget her name now. It's embarrassing. I should know. I've known her before, but anyway, it's not coming to me immediately now. But she brilliantly designed it so that it would not have wind, even though it's an 84-story building beside Lake Michigan at the bottom. So you can design out the wind through better design and tiering of buildings and different interventions with landscaping. The other thing that's so important is that because so many main streets are really wide, on really bad days, the wider streets in our downtown cores and main streets create big channels for wind to come in. So one of the things that a lot of winter cities have started to do is transform their alleys into places where there's commerce happening. Like the image on the bottom right is an alley. That is an alley that got transformed over time into a place with businesses that opened up. This was an alley, and now it looks like the one in the bottom right. The other thing you can do is just how do you make alleys better? How do you put public art and murals in them so they could be more attractive? Hang up stringer lights and other things, because if you want to get away from the wind, having alleys transformed is an easy intervention that can transform a space and make it a lot better. It can also add a lot more square footage to retail in the downtown. So cities like Melbourne, Australia, Victoria, British Columbia have been early adapters and leaders in converting their alleys into it. And so they really strictly control what happens with garbage pickup and other things in order to make sure that they can become 24/7 places for people. So capturing sunlight is also a really critical part of it. We do a lot of sunlight shadow studies. We model not just how the building performs, but how does it perform vis-a-vis other buildings in the area. That's really critical to do. As is the use of color and having some little fun with color. There's a reason that when we think of Northern Europe, we think of the use of color in homes and buildings, because when it's gray for half the year or 4 months of the year, color really matters and it makes a big difference. And the other thing is nightscaping. How do we do a lot more nightscaping, whether that's landscape lighting or it's architectural lighting? How do we embrace lighting? We got to keep the Christmas lights up all, for a bigger chunk of winter. Maybe the Christmas tree goes down after Christmas, but how do we keep the Christmas lights up so that even in January and February and March, we should keep them up on our homes or in our businesses, because they make a space so much more charming and magical in the middle of winter. And there's so many different cities that are having fun things happen in terms of creating space with light. And because LED lights are so inexpensive, they can be transformational. And Portsmouth is a historical city. It's got so many architectural details, and whether it's cornices on buildings and awnings and little details, whether it's Georgian and Edwardian architectural details, you put a little architectural light on that and it just becomes utterly amazing and Instagram worthy in a moment. So many cities have done things, and Bryant Park, for example, lights up the park from above, so it almost feels like a full moon, or even almost a setting sun, how bright it can be in Bryant Park in the middle of the winter. You can do these things with certain public spaces, and maybe you turn it off at 10 o'clock at night or 11 o'clock at night, but you can transform these spaces. You can add little details to, like this one here in Pershing Square in New York. You can add little architectural lights that make it a lot more magical for places to cross. And you can be really creative with it and challenge the local artist community to come up with different things. One of the things around Winter City and lights that we're starting to see is the use of theatrical lights. So getting for local theater companies, encouraging local theater companies to get involved in transforming spaces and take the brilliance that they have that they do in a theater and put it outside. To transform spaces and make them really interesting. Some cities have done even incredible things. This is I think a 12th century church in Croatia. I think it's Croatia, if I remember right. And they and what they did was amazing. All this detail you see is done with light, laser lights. So all that detail was done with laser light, and it's amazing. People love that. And you can turn where you do have buildings that are drab and more ugly, but you can use them as a canvas. So think of buildings and the darkness that comes in winter as you have a canvas of darkness, but allows you to do something whimsical and turn something really boring into something brilliant. You can even use buildings and public spaces, totally different to imagine. Just challenge the local artist community to do things with these spaces, and they can become brilliant places that are worthy of our affection. And, this example, which is from Nice, is, this area was doing okay at best in the dead of winter. They didn't do a lot of things in the middle of winter to make it a better city, but the one thing they did do, and they did do well, was to put up a lot of lights in the middle of winter, and overnight it became such a charming place that people love to go to. The other aspect is with winter city design is using a material and a palette. You go to so many ski resorts, and there's a reason why they use wood and stone. It makes us feel warm. When we see steel, it makes us feel cold. So we need to use a palette that reinforces warmth, that allows transparency between the inside and the outside. We need to have loggias that provide more places for people so that the snow and ice don't fall on them. Where we can't, we need to put in colonnades and awnings and canopies. We need to think about building entrances and how they work. I was at the MIT campus, and there was a building designed there by Frank Gehry. A star architect designed it, and what happened was they designed it, and unfortunately 80% of the doors to the building at this building on the MIT campus are not usable in the middle of winter because of falling ice. So it had been designed without adequate thinking about how ice works. Too often architects design for July and don't design for January. We need to think about building entrances and how we use color, and how do those entrances work when you do have falling ice? What is the relationship between the public realm and the inside of the building? How do they complement each other and make them warmer? How do we think of ski resorts and drawing on some of those examples, because we know that people love them. So how do we use some of those? How do we provide enough street furniture? Do we locate the street furniture in places so that they're not covered with 3 feet of snow, so that you actually can use them? Do we think about boulevard trees? Boulevard trees are so important. Not only do they provide shade for us in the middle of summer, but they provide a place for the snow to go when we're plowing. And B, they also protect pedestrians so that when a plow or a bus or big truck's going by, they don't get splashed with really gross brown water and slush. So boulevards are really critical to think about, as is planting. So what type of vegetation are we using? Are we using vegetation that only looks good in the middle of summer or the fall? Or are we using vegetation like ornamental grasses that look beautiful year round? Are we thinking about how we might change the topography to block the wind? In Edmonton, the worst wind is from the northwest. So we try to design public spaces so that we block out, and as much as we can, we try to deal with the wind attenuation through landscaping to block the northwest wind. So you can do different interventions that are going to block whatever the worst wind is. If it's from the ocean side or it's from the north in Portsmouth, you have to do things that are going to block that wind if you're going to make interventions. And the other thing I want to give an example here, and this is my last one on design, is too often when we think about winter design or any kind of design, we have to think, the first thing as soon as you say architectural excellence and design, people think cha-ching, big money. Well, they had a competition. They had a bridge, an underpass in Germany in this town of 80,000, and nobody liked to go under it. Pedestrians didn't like to go under it. Women didn't feel safe going there. This is what it looked like on the far left. Well, they had a design competition to see who could come up with the best idea to fix the bridge. Somebody came up with the idea, which is to transform the bridge into a Lego bridge. It cost $1,000 worth of paint. They now receive 20 million tourists a year to go photograph themselves beside the Lego bridge. And why? Because the most popular toy on planet Earth is Lego. People love Lego, and it's absolutely incredible. So all it cost was $1,000 of paint and a really good idea. And the point I want to make here is that design excellence sometimes requires less money, not more. There's a mayor in Brazil who famously said in a TED talk he did, if you want creativity and ingenuity and design excellence, take a zero off the budget. And that's how you really get creativity. So it's not sometimes always about spending big money. Sometimes it's about taking a zero off the budget and seeing who has the best idea and being open-minded towards it and finding an example like that. And there, I'm going to pause there and we'll take our last break. before I talk about radical incrementalism. So any questions about Winter City design?
You know, I see nothing specific to Winter City design, Simon, but I have a question for Emily. Are you going to be able to save the chat? And so that it's shareable?
Yeah, so that's something I've been thinking about is watching, while we haven't necessarily had any specific questions about the design aspects, there have just been some really great suggestions throughout the chat and people really have been utilizing it, which is great to see. So that's definitely something I've been thinking about is we can save it and capture all of these ideas and hopefully distill them in a way that's a little bit easier to read. But it would be great to share that, capture those and share that in another way. So yes, I was thinking that as well, and I'm hopeful to do that.
That's great because I am seeing some great ideas flying through there, and I'm just wondering. There's a couple of things that you've said, Simon, that are really striking home, I think, for some of our folks, and the ideas are starting to percolate. So I would challenge all of you, start putting things in the chat about where you find sunshine. When you go for a walk downtown, where are you finding sunshine? Bob, I think you put something in there about the one side of Daniel Street has some good sunshine. Where else? Where are you seeing sunshine? Throw that in the chat. Let's think about that. You know, let's think about how are we starting with baby steps? And sunshine is one of those baby steps. So let's find that. Let's also find wind. Where are we blocked from wind? Where do you sit? If you're going out to have a cup of coffee right now, you're wanting to sit outside because of COVID, you're grabbing a cup of coffee downtown. Where are you sitting? Where are you walking? Can we throw those places in the chat as well? So let's just start throwing them in there because Emily's going to save them for us and put them into a format that we can read. I do have, you mentioned cost here, Simon, and I do have a question here that I'd like to share with you. What's the balance of public and private input and investment in creating a winter city? What have you found is the best practice?
Well, literally this last chapter is exactly about that. So I could pivot if you want to the next chapter, or I could answer the next question, because literally this whole chapter is about, okay, great. How do you actually achieve Winter City? How do you actually implement all this?
Great. Let's seeing nothing very specific to the Winter City design and hoping that people's creative juices are now flowing and they're throwing stuff in the chat. Let's move on to the last one and then we can wrap it up in the general area.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So radical incrementalism is a term that I came up with a little while ago to describe a phenomena that I saw happening. And I was trying to figure out, well, how do you so many people come up with these BHAGs, so these big, hairy, audacious goals. And too often mayors or CEOs, they come up with these big ideas, but they 65% of the time, so 2/3 of the time, they never get implemented, because usually the length of time needed to implement these big ideas is longer than their tenure. And so to do something that's really transformational is longer than a mayor is going to be on council, longer than a president's going to be heading a company or organization. And so if you're really the big stuff where we want to see change or a paradigm shift really requires at the end of the day to embrace the power of little ideas. And so one of the things I want to talk about and give some examples of cities that have seen sea changes happen is that it really comes down to how do you build a coalition and a chorus of stakeholders. And that's what we did in Edmonton. So this last iteration of Winter City that I've been involved with is the 4th iteration that Edmonton's done in the last couple of generations. The previous 3 fell flat because it was really led by the council of the day or one particular person. And then when they were done, it just kind of, it fizzled out. The thing we did differently this time is we tried to take a systems model and make it about everything in all aspects of life, but we also try to make sure that it wasn't led or owned by a city councilor or a mayor or the Chamber of Commerce, but rather it was led by everybody. So we had the local Chamber of Commerce involved, different down to different bids were involved, NGOs, the arts communities, different communities that were involved, like the Filipino Association or the whatever, all kinds of, every kind of coalition you can imagine got involved, and we solicited them and asked who was willing to put in the volunteer hours and come up with a plan, and more importantly, who's willing to oversee the implementation. So a broad chorus of stakeholders got involved, and because we wanted to get people in town that were interested in owning this, and that knowing that the ownership of this had to come from the community, whether it's the business community, the arts community, but it had to come from the community and not from City Hall. If it came from City Hall, then it would fizzle out. And so if it comes from the community and you do the right things in terms of the right design threats and the right things that are going to build the coalition, then the community is going to own the story, and they're going to drive the implementation. So Chelsea, Quebec is the first story I'm going to give as something that went through a transformation. So Chelsea, Quebec is on the Quebec is not that far from Ottawa, Canada, probably about 25 minutes away to half an hour away from Ottawa. And it was an area back then. It wasn't really a bedroom community, but it really almost died. It was kind of it had one time been a mining and forestry town, and it had fallen on hard luck, and it wasn't doing that well. Well, they got together and they said, well, we've got some decent bones. We've got some nice historical buildings. We've got some good bones here. How do we transform ourselves? How do we become a tourist destination? If we become a tourist destination, maybe we'll become a really successful bedroom community for Ottawa, because we're within a half an hour of Ottawa. Well, they didn't have the money because they were a small town, like 10,000 people. They couldn't go out and drop millions here and there. So what they did was they got together as a broader group and they would sprinkle thousands. Well, 1,000, thousands here, but every year. And they adopted relentless progress. An attitude is no matter what happens, every year we do something to make our community better, no matter what, whether it's maybe this year we're only going to improve one heritage building. And now that next year we're going to make one park a little bit better. But no matter what, they had relentless progress. And every year we're going to do something to make our community better. Fast forward to today, and they have probably the most successful Nordic spa now in all of North America. They've had, I think, a Michelin star restaurant. They've had like a phenomenal foodie scene. They've had just like become this amazing, charming town to go to. And if you were to go there a generation ago, you think it was on a path towards becoming a ghost town. But they had this sea change because the community came together to reimagine themselves. Now, Boulder was never down on its luck, but many people wouldn't know that Boulder has the highest lease rate. The price per square foot of leasing space on Pearl Street in Boulder is higher than any other pedestrian street in America. And you think, well, Boulder's like, I know it's a nice college town and so forth, and it's about 100,000. But what is a place that's an hour drive from Denver and is only 100,000? What's it doing with the highest lease rates, price per square foot for commercial space of any pedestrian street in America? Like, how does that happen? Well, one of the things they did was they focused on 4-season design, and they embraced 4-season design. And every year they came up with a plan, and every year they've been doing something to implement the plan, to improve the public realm, to add more programming, to add more maintenance, and to make it relentlessly better. So the plan was, no matter what happens, every year we move the needle and make it an ever more charming place. So every year, how do we make it even that much more of a place worthy of people's affection? Lillehammer, which held the Olympics, and many of you would recall that it had the Olympics. Lillehammer is as far north as Anchorage. So imagine Lillehammer is 30,000 people. So imagine if Anchorage was 30,000 people and Anchorage had the Winter Olympics. That's basically what Lillehammer did. It's 4 hours north of Oslo, so not close to Oslo at all, 4 hours north of it. It's only 30,000 people, yet it held the Winter Olympics. And it did that, like the Chelsea example, it was a winter city that was very far north. I think it's at about 63 degrees latitude or something like that, 63 or 64 degrees latitude. So quite far north. And they were a city as well that was a mining and forestry town that had got down on its luck. But they said, well, how do we're going to, back in the day, they said, a generation ago, they said, or a generation before the Olympics, they said, how do we become the world's greatest small winter city? So how do we, aspirationally, how do we become known as the world's greatest place as a winter city? And they did things that built on their architecture. They changed the lighting they used. They changed the color of the buildings. They changed the winter infrastructure, their tourism. Everything was about winter. And to the point that they became so good at it and became so successful that they were a legitimate contender to put up their hand to host the Winter Olympics. And by gosh, they won it. And they held the Winter Olympics, which is just remarkable for a community of 30,000. The other example I want to give is Copenhagen. So after World War II, Copenhagen was down on its luck. It did what so many cities globally did. And they said, well, the city of the future is Los Angeles. We got to replace bikes with cars because that's modernity. And we want to embrace the modern economy and the modern era. And so in the 1970s, Copenhagen earnestly debated removing bikes from the city center because they were stealing capacity on roads away from cars. So Copenhagen came to the precipice and were about an inch away from banning bicycles from their city center because it was screwing up traffic. But because they did that, it became a clarion call. And all these different stakeholders got involved and said, well, that's not the vision we want for the future of Copenhagen. Instead of that, we aspire to become the world's most sustainable city. And so Copenhagen embraced all kinds of renewable energy starting in the 1970s. And Copenhagen went from having, in the 1970s, only 4% of trips were made by bike. And last year, 65% of all trips made in Copenhagen were done by bike. So they went from 4%, which is probably what Boston is today, to 65% of all their trips were done by Copenhagen. And they have a climate that's not too dissimilar to Portsmouth, which is transformational when you think of it. The point is that it can be done. Gainesville is another city that went for transformation. It's just outside FSU. It was an industrial area, blighted, down on its luck. And they came up with a plan that involved the arts community, the business communities, different NGOs, different stakeholders. And over a generation, they transformed an area that was once blighted, had a lot of crime, was not doing that well, into a charming place. But what they did was they implemented the change, and they didn't have the budget to spend tens of millions of dollars, but they did something every year, introducing new markets, introducing new activities, incrementally changing the infrastructure. They couldn't change it all at once, adding, one or every second or third year, they'd add a little bit more public art, and they do something so that every year they can move the needle and transform it. And now Gain Street outside FSU in Tallahassee is one of the best streets to go to within the whole community. And Vancouver is a city that's a little similar to Copenhagen. It held the World's Expo in 1986. And prior to 1986, it was as auto-oriented as any city, and it was as auto-oriented as Houston. And and they kind of said to themselves after Expo 86, we want to transform ourselves and become, and that we wanted, not Copenhagen, but we, Vancouver, want to be the world's most sustainable city. And that's our goal. We want to become the world's most sustainable city by 2020. And so they started building, they had no rail-based transit before 1986. So they started building rail-based transit, bike share. They added, created seawalls, added bike lanes. And some years they only had, the economy was soft and they only had money to build, a quarter mile of bike lanes. Some years they had more money and they build a few miles of bike lanes. But if you do that every year from 1986 on, you fast forward till 2020, and now huge numbers of people are riding bikes to get around and are walking, and they become a much more pedestrian-oriented, a much more livable city. And that kind of transformation from Houston level of car ownership and car ridership to now arguably competing with Copenhagen to be one of the world's most sustainable cities. Now only something like 30% of all trips in Vancouver are done by car, which is remarkable for a city of almost 3 million people. And that was not possible in 1985. And so that change happened in that period of time because they moved the needle. They did something every single year to move the needle. So the thing, and this is my last slide, but the thing that people need to, the thing that we understand when we started doing the design charrettes and we started doing this to build the broader social license so that the whole community of Edmonton would adopt and would own Winter City, was to start with, when we do it, and when I do design charrettes, I start with things like, I really segregate the conversation between the means and the outcomes, because 99% of people can talk to you about the means, but people really struggle to talk about the outcomes and say, what do we want this to be in 20 years from now? How are we going to measure 20 years from now success? What do we want people in 20 years from now to say about X? So usually when I do design charrette, whether it's a day or 3 days, the first part is really just a conversation about what is the vision, what are the aspirational goals? And once we put that to bed, then we move to outcomes, then we move to principles, then we get to the stuff, which is where people are most comfortable, which is, well, how much is it going to cost and who's going to do it and which department has it and which, but if you start with the bottom, then all the boo birds come out and they tell you the 100 reasons why you can't do it. And what's more important is to find consensus, is to start at that 30,000 feet and get consensus at 30,000 feet. And once you have consensus at 30,000 feet, then you go to 25,000 feet until you're at the weeds. And that's how you do it. And when you get all the boo birds at the bottom that are telling you why you can't do it, you're saying, well, you're validating, saying, well, you already agreed to these policies, some of these KPIs and the rest of it, and you've already built that social license. And when you have that broad social licensing, included influencers, and it's not just the business community or just the arts community or a social agency or just the city government, but it's a broader coalition, then that's how you build the consensus needed to drive radical incrementalism so this community can have a paradigm shift over a generation. And with that, I want to thank you very much for listening to me.
I think that I am not the only one whose head is like, you know, the top of my head is coming off now with all the great ideas and all the ways that we can get together and implement radical incrementalism. I think it sounds, what a fabulous idea. Love that. And I see a lot of good ideas flying around here. And I'm just seeing coming up on the chat. Very good presentation. I agree. That's I think that Simon has given us a lot to think about. There are a couple of questions. I think that you've touched on some of them, and I'll try to see what mechanisms have you put in place to ensure renewed interest and enthusiasm for the project over time. I think you talked about turnover and making sure that there's a long lifespan for the ideas. Simon, can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Who oversees, who coordinates, who carries it out, that sort of thing?
We try to make sure that the folks that did the plan stayed involved for the first stage of implementation, because sometimes when the people that do the plan and people who do the implementation are two different things. And the people that do the implementation don't understand the why, they only know the what. And it's important that the people that give the implementation and inertia that you hope to turn into momentum, that the people that are driving that inertia understand the why. And so I've been involved for 8 years now, and so I understand all the why questions. And incrementally, we've gotten the turnover of people that are on the overarching committee doing this, and then we have 4 different sub groups of the board that are driving this, all volunteers who are doing it, and we've had turnovers for all kinds of obvious reasons over that period of time. But you have enough that you've been able to have that transfer of knowledge to understand the why, and we made sure that we're kind of picking people that both have the capacity to be volunteers, but people that earnestly care about the community and city building and really want to do it. The other thing we've done to truly kind of keep the flame warm is to make sure that we're very active and prolific on social media, to make sure that we're disseminating information, we're promoting activities, whether it's outdoor patio events or winter festivals, whether it's about poking people and prodding people to have conversations about Winter City, and to do that, to really kind of stand up and advocate for things and to build some obvious coalitions with people who are sympathetic with making the city better in winter. So we've really done that, and that's kind of helped keep it warm. And now it's nice because when I started my career as an urban planner in the late 90s, nobody was talking about Winter City. And now, 8 years after we started this, in the local environment, it's baked into the lexicon. Everybody talks about Winter City. And even as recently as 10 years ago, and I already alluded to this, if people were talking about winter 10 years ago, it was only about how horrible it was. And if it was about city life, it was simply that the city should be doing more to plow the roads. And that was it. And now we've had this environment where people, the average layperson is talking about Winter City design and are pumped about winter festivals. And one of the other things we've really, and maybe my last point on this, is that one of the best things we've discovered about winter festivals is that new Canadians embrace winter festivals more than people who've been in Canada for generations. Because I think when you come to Canada and you've immigrated here, maybe from India or from South Africa or from Mexico or from maybe it's from Italy, you can see the magic of it. You can see how special and unique it is. And I think when it's the air you breathe and the water you swim in, you don't appreciate how unique it is. But some of the winter festivals we have that are really, really charming and do some incredible things. The people who are tourists or the people that are new Canadians, it just blows them away. And so we've also tried to create this. We've been very deliberate with some of our winter festivals and winter activities to create Instagram worthy moments. So deliberately to curate things, to create Instagram worthy moments so that we would dramatically increase and amplify the quantity of people seeing it, and so that the story would be louder and resonate further.
I'm seeing some great energy coming through on the chat. People want to take action. People want to move on this, Simon, and I think you've inspired people to do that. Bob White, I applaud everything that the Alliance of Portsmouth Design Professionals has been doing. Ann Weidman gave an amazing presentation today to the Task Force Blue Ribbon Committee and showed a lot of the work that you have done. I think you're also our local inspiration team. And I think that between the Alliance and the Blue Ribbon Committee, the City Council, the city staff, and the Chamber, I think that I think you have a built-in coalition already. And with all of these ideas and all of this energy that you've inspired in us, Simon, I think that there's definitely a path forward here. So I appreciate that. And if anybody has any further questions, I am happy to direct them to Simon. If not, I know that we are intending to stop at 8:30, but it's just so exciting that we're all still here because I think we all want to get moving on this. As I mentioned earlier, I come from ski country. And when I first started in ski country, it was a ski town. It was a winter town. It was not a summer town. And we realized the reverse of what it is that we're talking right here is that we had to be a four-season community. And one of the ways that we did that, and I've seen some ideas flying through here about festivals and events and that sort of thing. What we learned to do was to go find an event that already happened in the summer and bring it to us. So I would challenge us to think about looking at winter festivals that are already there, that already exist, that are put on by people who know what they're doing. They have experience in this, and ask them to come with us, come to us. Somebody wrote something about ice sculptures. There is a master ice sculptor competition that goes not only around the country, but around the world. And Simon, you've seen these all over the place, as have I, and they draw in people like crazy. And it's even something that you can do with COVID, because you can come and watch an ice sculptor and stay safely distanced. So it's something that we could start next week, if we wanted to do something like that. So I think one of our challenges really is to go and look and find these events, decide what would fit for us in Portsmouth, and then invite them to come and talk to us about it. I think that would be one of the first steps that we might consider. Simon, if you have some other first steps like that, we'd love to hear them.
Well, I think part of it is finding out who has a passion and interest for it, right? Because it takes, that initial, to get that inertia does require, a heroic amount of effort to get it going. But finding people that are really civic minded, that deeply care, and that care about great placemaking, and that care about the community, finding those kind of passionate people that are willing to kind of put the time in, and then if there are staff from different organizations, whether it's a local bid or the chamber or a city government that can, if there are ever people that are able to contribute, that also kind of helps it as well. And then whether it's providing a venue or other things, that's really kind of critical. And the easiest way is almost, a cheater way would almost be, like I said, you could cheat and look at some of the things that Edmonton's almost created as one example. And we're not the only city that's done it, but probably, I'd argue, probably one of the leading cities in it in the world. We've had visitors from China, Mongolia, Japan, Northern Europe come to study us and crib ideas. And I really would encourage people to look at, it could even be as simple as the first workshop is getting people together and talking aspirationally about what you want, but in taking some of these ideas. And the other part of it would be, you know, looking at some of the documents, for example, that Winter City Edmonton's created off the website, and then almost like ticking them off and saying, well, this one would apply to this, you know, to this square, and whether it's Prescott Park or something else, I could see this in Prescott Park and maybe this to this area, and that concept that would work here. And maybe 5% of it works and maybe 35% of it works. But to kind of use that as a starting point and maybe to kind of create some inertia and then discuss it. And then aspirationally say, you know, there's never enough money day one to implement it all, but start to pick what would be the one that would give us some inertia, what would be the one that generate the most excitement, what would generate the most buzz. The other thing we try to do is try to get influencers involved as well. They didn't have to be all the heroic champions doing all the work, but we also knew that to kind of spread the word, to get the people that are, whether they're active in social media and doing that, or they were local influencers. We actually would literally go meet with local news stations, for example. And even the fun things we did was, you know, the weather people on the TV stations like to make it out like it's never bad, it's really bad. And so we would, one of the things we like to do with them was to say, you know, I know it's kind of fun to, you know, the TV news likes to be sensationalistic. And, you know, if it bleeds, it leads, or if it's, you know, unbelievably atrocious weather, it gets attention. But, you know, we're also saying you're kind of doing a disservice for the community when you're doing that. You know, not every day in winter is horrid. And there's some days in winter that can be really comfortable, especially those days that are blue sky and sunny. And maybe it's only, you know, 25 degrees Fahrenheit locally, but it's a dry cold. And if there's no wind and it's sunny, you can be outside for hours and it's really comfortable. So part of it was trying to change the narrative.
And I think that's what we need to do. Again, we're back to good clothing choices and being excited about being outside. So and a lot of us are skiers, you know, but our mentality is, well, I have to put all those clothes on when I go up to the mountain. I don't have to wear them downtown.
100%. Yeah.
But yes, we do. And we could be quite comfortable and quite happy down there. So thank you for bringing that forward for us, Simon. I want to thank Councillors McEachern and Lazenby for being here. I know the Economic Development Manager was also on for a while. And I think it's important for our city to be listening and involved. And I thank you for being here to do that. So if there's no other questions, and Emily, I don't see any other new questions here coming in. Did you? I don't want to shortchange anybody. It looks like we don't. So I know that Emily is going to do a wrap up, and I will give my thanks to Simon and to everybody who participated today. What a great conversation. And thank you for saving the chat and for recording this, Emily, and for Smart Growth for putting this on. Fabulous.
Yeah, big thank you both to Simon for all of your knowledge. That was a lot, and I'm still processing all of it. That was incredible. And Valerie, thank you so much for stepping in and moderating and voicing some of the questions that we've had and sharing some of your wonderful expertise. Really, really thank you to both of you, and thank you to everyone for showing up this evening. We're recording the video and we will share that on our website. We will also capture the chat conversation. There have been so many great ideas shared in that, and we will find a way to share that information. And then also, I know the Edmonton Winter City Strategy and Initiative has a whole packet of information as well. So we'll try to get you some additional information I know in the chat, people are asking some really specific questions about particular materials. And so I will share those with Simon and see if he has any other thoughts about that we could distribute to people as well. So we will hopefully be distributing a bunch of information that came out of this evening's presentation to everyone. But there's just so much, both between Simon's presentation and the chats, that's been really inspiring this evening, and I really appreciate everyone being here. Once again, a big thank you to our season sponsors, Piscataqua Savings Bank and the Jeffrey E. Clark and Martha Fuller Clark Fund of the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, and a huge thank you to our event partners, 3S Art Space, Seacoast Media Group, and the Chamber Collaborative of Greater Portsmouth. And like I said, we will be posting a lot of this information. You can go to our website, which is portsmouthsmartgrowth.org, where we will have the video. It'll take us a little while to get it up, but we will be posting that video. You can also make donations there as well. Like we said, we're all volunteer, all nonprofit. So we fundraise for each individual event. So thank you everyone again for your time and for sharing all of your thoughts and ideas. And we really appreciate it. And thanks again. Have a great night.